I was so excited to talk to Joanna Lillis. She's a British journalist based in Kazakhstan. Joanna has reported on Central Asia for over 20 years now, and her work and her experiences inform her brilliant book, Dark Shadows, Inside the Secret World of Kazakhstan. In our conversation today, we do a deep dive into the country's deeply complicated relationship with Russia, whether there's any real prospect of Beijing's influence displacing Moscow's, as well as looking at how ordinary Kazakhs engage with its authoritarian government. Joanna also teaches me a Kazakh swear word. I should also warn you that at one point you may hear my puppy barking and giving a little wail as he hopes to get in and listen to Joanna himself. Joanna, thank you very much for agreeing to be a guest.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm going to start by asking, what is your favourite word?
Favourite word? Well, I have a lot of favourite words in English, actually, and I have a lot of favourite. I have some words I like in Russian too, quite a lot of them, but I'm going to go for Idaha. It's a Kazakh word, and it means dragon. And I like it because it sounds nice, because it was one of the first words I learned when I started learning Kazakh, bizarrely. And I always liked it because it had one of these special H's in it. And it always stuck with me. I always struggled to remember Kazakh vocabulary, especially at the beginning when it was all quite strange. And that was, for some reason, one of the words that stuck with me. So there it is, Idaha.
What was the context of learning it?
Well, I guess it popped up in some folktale that I was learning in a class, and yeah, that's why it stuck with me. One of the first words I was able to remember.
What is your least favourite word?
My least favourite word at the moment. My least favourite word. Well, let's make it two words. Well, I'm struggling to choose between fake news when people use it and when they themselves are propagating fake news, and also the voice of the people. You know, people who say they're speaking with the voice of the people. Sorry, that's a few words, but I think I'm going to go with voice of the people.
Yeah. What is your favourite swear word?
My favourite swear word. Oh, well, I've got some choice ones that I do like to use in English, but I'm going to have to go with a Kazakh one, I think. So I'm going to go with shesheng, which actually isn't that rude on its own. It actually means your mother, but you can probably fill in the gaps there. And, you do hear people say it all the time. So shesheng.
I mean, I don't know if you saw that Kamala Harris's favourite swear word is motherfucker.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, she was up there. She's surrounded by quite a few of them. So,
have there been any notable times in your career where you've used that word?
Well, I think it's fair. That's a good question. I think it's fair to say that there's been quite a few times in my career when I've resorted to swearing, usually under my breath. I think times in my career that have been the most frustrating have probably been, well, there are times when someone prevents you trying to do your journalism, trying to, like maybe authorities trying to get involved and follow you or something, and that makes you kind of swear under your breath, though obviously not at them. And other times that really make me swear, I think, are times when you see kind of leaders in Central Asia really pretending to take account of what their people want, but actually kind of governing for themselves all the time, governing for themselves, extending their terms, flouting basic rules of democracy that they claim to espouse. Those are the times when I've kind of sweared at my screen, shall we say. Sworn at my screen, even.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
I like the sound of trains. When they're going past, if you're in the night or when you're on a train, that's a very soothing sound, I think, except when they blow their horns.
I mean, early this year, I'd always wanted to solo travel, and at the start of the year, I decided to get trains around France and Spain, and so it is great, just the gentle, like, yeah. What is a
Exactly.
sound or noise? What is a sound or noise that you hate?
Sound of traffic. And we're surrounded by it in Almaty most of the time. I hate the sound of traffic, and I hate the sound of angry drivers beeping their horns when it's not going to help. And I hate the sound of drivers beeping and swearing at pedestrians when, they're the traffic, we're the pedestrians. They're the ones taking up the space.
Uh, do you have any guilty pleasures?
My guilty pleasure in Kazakhstan is Kazakhstan chocolate. Very good if you haven't tried it. Comes
Right.
in a nice blue wrapper with a kind of Kazakh flag type thing on it, and it doesn't only look good, but it tastes good too.
Nice. What is your favorite book?
Oh, my favorite book. Now that's a really tough one, I think. Especially, you read a lot of books in your lifetime, and it's really, really, really hard to choose out of everything you've ever read. What's your favorite? And sometimes I'm always inclined to say the last one I read. But I mean, I think given that the listeners are probably interested in Central Asia, I'm going to pick one that has been an enduring favorite with me, which is called in Russian. It was written in Russian in Soviet times by Chingiz Aitmatov, who is a Kyrgyz writer. And in Russian, it's called Dien Dolshe Veka, which literally means the day is longer than an age. And it has an English translation, which the day is longer than a century is the literal translation, I guess. And the English translation is something similar. But anyway, it was very advanced for its time. It's a kind of Soviet magic realism type thing. And having been reared when I was at university on sort of socialist realism, and some of the duller examples of it sometimes kind of show us what it was really about showing socialist values through literature. I was very surprised when I came across this book by myself and read it, I guess soon after I left university, and found this kind of very magical world written by a Kyrgyz writer and actually set in Kazakhstan, and in fact revolving around the railways partly as well, and also with some forays into space.
Right.
So it's definitely worth a read.
Is there a fictional character who you imagine yourself to be?
Um, well, I can't say that I've ever imagined myself to be one. I think if who I'd like to be, maybe maybe is another way of framing it. I can't say I've ever imagined myself to be one, but I guess the fictional character that I think would be a great role model would be Tomaris, the Kazakh hero. I can't even remember what century exactly she lived in, but she was a famous female warrior leader, and I think she's a great role model for anyone and for any women and for any Kazakhs.
So when I interviewed Anna Reid a few weeks ago, she talked about how her interest into Russia and Eastern Europe started when she purely by chance went to Poland in the 1980s, and that was her sort of introduction to the region, and it started on her sort of lifelong interest. And I guess it was sort of similar for you, sort of studying in Russia. So I'm kind of curious about what drew you to the region, and what was it that sort of captured your imagination?
Well, yeah, I mean, I started studying Russian when I was 16. So for my A levels, for what we do in Britain as A levels from 16 to 18. And actually, there was an element of chance there for sure, because I was very, very keen on languages, and that was my favorite things at school. And when I went off to sixth form college, I had to pick something I couldn't do closer to home in order to receive a travel grant, and so I picked Russian. And that's how it came about. And then I became really into it, and then went on to study Russian and French at university. And it really was a lifelong interest. It was a bit of a chance choice in a way, and of course I could have just done it and then given it up and gone on to do something else, but I became really interested in it and went on to study Russian at university, and then to study in the Soviet Union. And I think my choice was also informed by the fact that this was a big issue of the day, I guess. I mean, at the time, the Soviet Union was always in the news. We were kind of just coming when I started to study. It was just coming into the tail end of the Cold War, and there was a lot of excitement began at the time when I started studying it about Mikhail Gorbachev, the reforming leader. Then he visited the UK at one point, and there was a lot of TV shows about Russia at the time, about the Soviet Union rather, and so that's how I became interested in it. And then when I studied in Russia initially, well, I studied in the Soviet Union, sorry, not in Russia, initially in Minsk, in what's now Belarus, in 1988, and then in Kiev, in Ukraine in 1989. And, I became really fascinated, especially because this was a chance when, we could really reforms and perestroika, glasnost, as the reforms were called, were at their height. And as students, we were able to kind of get out of the box that students had been put in all the years before. A small group of us from Leeds University were sent to Kiev, which had not happened before. Students were foreign students were marshaled in big groups to a couple of places in the Soviet Union previously. And we were able to really talk to the students there about the issues of the day, about how they felt about the reforms, and about things like the Afghan war, the Soviet-Afghan war that was disastrously coming to an end at that time. So, after that, I was very fascinated by it and wanted to go back to the Soviet Union. And then it collapsed just as I sort of was graduating. And I subsequently went back to work in Moscow and then ended up in Central Asia.
There's a comment you make in the book how at one point you were sort of thinking of being like a UN translator, but you actually much preferred sort of being on the ground. So what was it like? What drew you to like being a journalist, being on the ground, being with people?
Yeah, I mean, I after I'd worked in Moscow for a year or so, and then a couple of other places, I went back and did a master's in interpreting and translating with Russian and French as my specialities. And because I was always drawn to languages, and I'd always wanted to do that master's, and I had thought of becoming an interpreter, a sort of simultaneous interpreter at the UN, and so on and so forth. And that I completed the master's, and it was a definite possibility. There were job openings in places like UNESCO in Paris that were promising. But I did very much want to go back to Russia at that time. And I did feel like if I took up a job in Paris, it could become like a bit of a golden cage, and I would never leave a well-paid job as an interpreter and never go and do those things and the exciting times in Russia were happening then, not in a few years' time, I wanted to go and experience those times on the ground. So I decided to basically move to Russia instead and just find a job there. And so I initially worked at the British Embassy, in fact, as in a job called Social Secretary to the Ambassador, which wasn't perhaps my forte as such, but it was an interesting job because I also met, because I organised his social events, I met a lot of the movers and shakers of the time, the politicians, the oligarchs, who became very famous around that time, and some of whom died in their bath later, and so on. So that was interesting, but I was looking for something that was a bit more suited to my skills, and so I then found an opening at BBC Monitoring in Moscow. BBC Monitoring being an arm of the BBC that doesn't report as such, but monitors the local media and writes it up, translates, etc., for analysis, and also to provide fodder for the rest of the BBC news departments. And so that's how I kind of fell into journalism, and that's how I fell into Central Asia later, moving to Uzbekistan with BBC Monitoring.
In Dark Shadows, you mentioned that for a long time you viewed Central Asia through a Russian prism, but by living in the region and traveling across it, your perspective started to change. I'm curious, what was that Russian view, and what did you come to realize?
Well, I think being from Moscow, and and I think this is very much still the case now. And I think we could talk a lot about views from Moscow of its former colonies in the context of the war in Ukraine, of Russia's war in Ukraine. And so I think seen from Moscow, Moscow, still, when I was living there in the early 90s, and then again for 5 years from 95 to 2000, it was still very much saw itself as the center of a bunch of colonies, actually. Although in the early 90s and in the 90s generally, there was much less focus on the former it was Russia trying to get back on its feet as Russia, and everyone had their independence. But there was, I think, with hindsight, I can see there was a pretty patronising attitude towards the other parts of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, Georgia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And I used to, as I said, I used to monitor the television. So we used to watch the news, pick out interesting reports, translate them, or analyse them. From there I learned a lot about other parts of the Soviet Union that I didn't know about before, especially its eastern parts, including Central Asia and the Caucasus, partly because the Tajik civil war was going on at that time. But I think basically, to put it in a nutshell, there was a clear colonial attitude towards these now independent countries. And I didn't, of course, imbue that attitude as such, but I thought that some of the countries were much more Slavicized, if I can say that, or Russianized than they actually are. Because at that time, at least at the beginning, I'd have studied in Belarus and Ukraine, both Slavic countries. And in Moscow, I also started to travel more widely. My first visit to Central Asia was to Kyrgyzstan in 1998. But it was only when I moved to Uzbekistan that I really saw that there was so much more perspectives to these countries than to just being some kind of satellite of Moscow. I mean, one very obvious example is that, often going around many parts of the Soviet Union, it was taken at that time as read that Russian would get you everywhere. But when I got to Uzbekistan, I actually found there were parts of Uzbekistan where Russian wouldn't take you very far. And this was only 10 years after independence. And now there are parts of Uzbekistan where Russian will take you even less far. Because, even nowadays, even in big cities, many young people don't really speak Russian very well at all. Because, they don't need to these days. So I think there was a lot of that, the sort of language, the idea that, not everything is seen from Moscow, because bearing in mind that I had been studying Russian and working in Russia for maybe 15 years at that point. So I guess I had quite a Russian-centric view. And moving to Uzbekistan, where the culture is very different, the language is different, and people have a very different world outlook, actually, in many ways. Although, there's still some common, even nowadays, there's still some common kind of post-Soviet outlooks that we find in common. But all that was a bit of a wake-up call. And, I think it showed me something very different. And now I've been living in Central Asia. I've been living in Kazakhstan for nearly 20 years, in Central Asia for nearly 25. And I can very much see it's very pronounced now, the ongoing kind of Russian colonial attitudes that you do encounter, both among officialdom and among ordinary sort of people in Russia towards Central Asia. You still feel that, and that's taken on a very, very sharp kind of accent or emphasis among people here, I think, now, because of the war in Ukraine, and because there's been sort of influx of Russians into Central Asia seeking refuge, and there have been, even among some of those are very conscious about not appearing to be, have colonial attitudes. Others perhaps simply don't realize what they're doing and demonstrate those attitudes.
A sort of funny / chilling bit of the book is just after the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, and Putin made a comment about how Kazakhstan isn't a real country, and how that sort of provoked an attempt to do a sort of Game of Thrones-esque TV show about the origins of Kazakhstan.
That's absolutely right. 2014 was a pivotal moment for Kazakhstan, as well as for Ukraine and Russia, with the annexation of Crimea. And I think it was a pivotal moment for many in the Soviet Union, many of the countries, when, really Russia's showing its true colors, showing that it has imperial ambitions. Although we'd had the war in Georgia before, that should have been enough to show that. And it's absolutely the case that Putin made some remarks at a press conference to what was clearly a planted question asked by a young woman. It was obviously planted, about whether one could expect a sort of Ukraine-style scenario in Kazakhstan. And bearing in mind that at the time, a Ukraine-style scenario meant an annexation of a region, not a full-scale invasion as we see now, but still extremely frightening. and threatening. So Putin couched his reply in terms that were supposed to be on the surface flattering for Nursultan Nazarbayev, the then president of Kazakhstan, describing him as a kind of an astute leader who knew where his best interests lie. And I think he specifically said in the greater Russian world, and also saying, while praising the first president's sort of formation of a country, he managed to do that by implying or sort of virtually stating that Kazakhstan had never been a country before, as in it had a very short history, as in a stretch from that could take you to these kind of arguments about Ukraine as well, that it's not a real country, as put forward by Russian imperialists. So that's pretty threatening. And, obviously the Kazakh government would never say that their riposte to this was to kind of bring to the fore ancient claims about Kazakh statehood. But very quickly after that, they instituted a celebration of I think it was the 550th anniversary of Kazakh statehood, which was then dated to forming in 1465, when the first Kazakh Khanate arose. Short-lived, admittedly, but in various forms it did persist for, a long time. Now, we could obviously argue for hours about the merits or not of that historical take, but I think the lesson, the interesting geopolitical lesson from nowadays is that at first it focused that history had always been in the history books in Kazakhstan, but it made the Kazakhs much more keen to kind of put it out there, also to kind of promote it among their own people with through popular culture, and to also promote it abroad, as trying to say we're not a 30-year-old country, we have a longer history than that. So it was very interesting, and there were very big celebrations of statehood in 2015, lots of events. And then there was, of course, this TV show, the miniseries Come Film. It was rather dramatic and sold as a kind of Game of Thrones, and lots of great shots on the set, great pictures of Kazakh culture and countryside and so on. And in fact, interestingly, only last week in Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, the World Nomad Games took place, and we see how very much invested Kazakhstan is in this. I think I see in some of the kind of elements that were brought to the fore in 2015, very much to the fore in public for the first time, perhaps in Kazakhstan. And we really saw them putting on a great show. And I think there's a great pride now in Kazakhstan, thanks to Putin, in the history and traditions, perhaps. But of course, the flip side of that is that Putin's remarks for the 10 years that since he made those remarks, we've seen those kind of constant remarks made about Kazakhstan by Russian imperialists, including members of the parliament in Russia, never by Russian officials as such, but certainly by opinion formers. And that's the other side of it. I mean, you see this constant attempts to undermine and troll Kazakh statehood and history.
Sort of related to that, something else that Anna Reid and I discussed was sort of the different approaches to history between Ukraine and Russia. It seems that Putin will often accuse Ukrainians of doing terrible things that Russia actually did on a much larger scale. So whether it's sort of collaboration with Nazis or sort of acquiescing to the Holocaust, there'll be sticks with which to beat the Ukrainians, but things like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact are just forgotten. But I guess the difference is that Ukrainians process that history in a way that Russians don't. And I don't know if you saw that Ukraine has just launched I think it's Ukraine History Global Initiative. And it's an attempt to sort of bringing in scholars from sort of around the world to tell a uniquely Ukrainian history of the country. And put it in the context of world history to try and get away from the sort of Russian interpretation. Reading Dark Shadows, the impression I got was that the Kazakh government's been reluctant to grapple with its own recent traumatic history, partly because of which country was the perpetrator, and partly because it might provoke awkward questions about the regime being a post-Soviet one.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think Ukraine has had certainly had much more cause to kind of grapple with that, and given the sort of the different types of relations between Kazakhstan and Russia and Kazakhstan and Ukraine has been much more forward about being critical of Russia's role in its history, and that doesn't only begin with this war, obviously, or with the annexation of Crimea. That's been for many years in Ukraine. And Kazakhstan, as you mentioned, and as I wrote about in Dark Shadows, the sort of government has been much more reluctant to air all this history openly. Now, we should also bear in mind that I wrote Dark Shadows when Nursultan Nazarbayev was still the president. Now, since he resigned in 2019, there's a different president, and it likes to present itself as a much different kind of administration under Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, the president nowadays. And I would say there's a bit more discussion of history than there was under Nazarbayev. Now, the history, of course, has always been there. I mean, for the Kazakhs, and one of the big and tragic events has been the famine in Kazakhstan in the 1930s. Now, the Ukrainian famine, which is obviously had the same or certainly similar causes and occurred at around the same time, is pretty well known in the West, not least because of Ukrainian attempts to make people know about it. And the Kazakh famine, much less well known. I'm surprised how I often come across people who really had no idea about the famine until, say, they read Dark Shadows or something like that. Now, under Nazarbayev, the famine was commemorated, but the causes are kind of glossed over. I mean, in Kazakhstan, the tendency has been to present some of this, much of this history as a sort of collective tragedy. Nobody's at fault. It's a collective tragedy for everyone because, of course, southern Russia also experienced this famine. But in Kazakhstan, I mean, it's very notable that in Kazakhstan, it destroyed an entire way of life forever. In fact, the collectivization of agriculture in Central Asia, and the subsequent famine that it caused, it basically eradicated the nomadic civilization from the Soviet Union at the time, and that was the end of it. Basically, I mean, in Kyrgyzstan, you still have a few sort of semi-nomads, just about, but in these countries in Central Asia, that nomadic existence is no longer, it no longer exists because of that, and it was wiped out in the space of a mere few years. So very traumatic. It also sent Kazakhs fleeing, far and wide to find food. China, Mongolia, Iran, and many other places too, Turkey, Kashmir. All of this has been presented as a collective tragedy. There are nowadays there's more open discussion of that, although even under Nazarbayev there was discussion, but it was kind of frowned upon by the government. These days the government also still a very big ally of Russia, but I think people are more outspoken, and because of the war in Ukraine, they're more wishing to delve into their history and wonder about things. Now, it's kind of in an early stage, I guess, in Kazakhstan, all this stuff. And there is always this temptation to politicize history in any country. And there is always going to be in Kazakhstan, certainly in the foreseeable future, an unwillingness to antagonize Russia on the official level. So that's always going to put a brakes on open discussion of the things that happen. It is a bit frustrating sometimes to see these commemorations of the famine and the victims of repression. It happens on one day every year, May the 31st, without an open discussion of who was responsible, why this happened. And I think, that's something Kazakhstan does need to have, along with all the countries of Central Asia and all the post-Soviet countries. And it's also something that should be done honestly, without just blame gaming as well,
Connected to that, the glossing over, a fact that really surprised me reading Dark Shadows is that at the time of Kazakhstan's independence, Kazakhs were a minority in the country, and it's only recently that they've become a majority.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a psychological factor in the entire country's national identity, in the psyche, that you really can't underestimate. Kazakhstan was the only Soviet republic when the Soviet Union collapsed that did have its titular nation in a minority, in an actual minority. Although they numbered slightly more than Russians, both were nearly 40%. But this was the only country newly independent country where the titular nation was in a minority, and that left Kazakhs in a different position to many other countries, even though there are countries which had very also had large minorities, Kyrgyzstan for one, for example. But I think that on the psyche, you can't underestimate how that made the Kazakhs feel, as their country was not only because of famine, but also, I mean, you can go back to, there are many things that made Kazakhs flee or made the demographics of Kazakhstan such as it is, dating back to, fleeing conscription under Tsarist Russia in 1916, then the famine in the 20s, civil war in the 20s, big famine in the 1930s, and then sort of this kind of demographic experiment of Stalin's of deporting entire peoples to different parts of the Soviet Union from where they started. And Kazakhstan was one of the sort of dumping grounds. Central Asia at large was one of the dumping grounds, but Kazakhstan certainly had huge numbers of people pouring in from, Poles, Ukrainians, Messetian Turks from the Caucasus, so Poles, Ukrainians, Germans from the European part of the Soviet Union, Messetian Turks from the Caucasus, Kurds, and then or Chechens, and many more Crimean Tatars, many more, pouring into Kazakhstan, and all these kind of death rate in the famine, the influx of people from other parts of the Soviet Union during the 40s and the 30s too. All of these things contributed to this situation. And I think it's something that the government was very conscious of at independence, because it's a great big challenge to form a nation, and when it's thrust upon you unexpectedly, as it was. I don't think many people saw the collapse of the Soviet Union coming, really. And I think that was an extra challenge for Kazakhstan. You've got all these minorities. You don't want violence. You want them all to live together. Neither do you want to kind of particularly antagonize the largest minority, who are almost as large as the Kazakh group, the Russians, and you don't want to antagonize that large group, but neither do you want to antagonize Russia, which obviously feels something to, I mean, under Putin, that became much more pronounced, this idea that Putin protects Russians all over the world. So yeah, I think that's a big thing on the psyche, and it's very interesting demographic change. I mean, I trace this history of the demographics in Dark Shadows, and it's been a real jump from being 40%, just under 40% of the population for Kazakhs, to now being basically nearly 70%. And Russians have gone down from about 40% to about 15% now. And there are many things that account for that, including outward migration of Russians, especially in the 90s, but I guess ongoing to a degree, and lower birth rates among Russians than among Kazakhs and other Turkic groups that live in Kazakhstan, and also the program that the government adopted to bring all ethnic Kazakhs, to bring them to Kazakhstan to live and give them citizenship if they wanted. And that's brought about 1 million Kazakhs back to the country since independence. So these would be, some of them maybe had their ancestral homelands in other countries. They're parts of southern Russia, lots of Kazakhs born there, parts of China, but others would have been descendants of people who fled famine, revolution, and so on, and have come. So people have come from all kinds of countries, both post-Soviet countries, Russia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, also neighboring countries like Mongolia, China, and countries further afield like Iran and Turkey. So, it's quite a melting pot. Kazakhstan's always been a melting pot, and for many years anyway. And bringing Kazakhs under this program, which under Nazarbayev was called Voralman, meaning returnee, but is now called Kandas, meaning compatriot. It's kind of added to the melting pot in a way. Although they're all Kazakhs, they often come from different backgrounds and all that. And Kazakhstan remains a melting pot, with minorities at about 30%.
I was reading something the other day that brought home to me this sort of delicate diplomatic tightrope that Kazakhstan's walking, which is this sort of drive to replace the Russian Cyrillic alphabet with a Latin alphabet. And I was reading that there are some people in Kazakhstan who want to speed up that process, but I think Tokayev said that he's fine with the current pace, I guess with a view to sort of reassuring the sort of Russian minority that they're not under threat and they don't need assistance from Moscow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this alphabet change is fascinating. I mean, it's been on the table for well over a decade. And it's been, it was even announced over a decade ago that this would happen at some point. It was basically always on the table, always going to happen, sort of thing. And then a few years ago, under Nazarbayev, it was announced that it would happen, and there was a timetable. I forget which exact year it was announced, but the timetable was initially to 2025, which is a while away then. It would have been about 6-7 years before. And now we should also stress that the transition of alphabet is for the Kazakh language only, and not for the Russian that's used in Kazakhstan. So Russian would continue, or is and does continue, to be written in Cyrillic, and after alphabet change will continue to be written in Cyrillic, just as Russian is in Russia, exactly the same. So the change affects the Kazakh language, which is a Turkic language unrelated to Russia and closely related to, well, to varying degrees of closeness, related to Turkish and to the languages of some of the neighboring countries, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and also Uyghur, as spoken in by the Uyghurs of Xinjiang. So, the Kazakh language is treated separately from the Russian language in Kazakhstan, and the change has gone in fits and starts. I mean, the first version of the alphabet that was publicized a few years ago under Nazarbayev created a big uproar. People didn't like it. I mean, it used kind of commas as diacritics, and people thought it was complicated and ugly, I suppose, although that's a very subjective view. And then a different version was adopted, and then a lot of discussion about should it be like Turkish alphabet and so on. And in the end, its own version was adopted. So it's become kind of complex and bogged down in discussion. A version was adopted, and then it was amended a few years later. And then it seemed to me it slowed down a bit after the invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion in 2022. It seemed to me that slowed down, and it's kind of proceeding slowly. I mean, given that the initial deadline was 2025, that's only next year, and it slipped again, I think, to 26 or a little bit later. But it's still supposed to happen, put it that way. Now, the long transition was to give people time to get used to it and to teach the younger generation the new Kazakh alphabet as they were coming through school. But the long transition has also resulted in quite a mishmash on the streets. I mean, we see signs in the Kazakh language. We see signs in the Cyrillic, which is the sort of current alphabet, and we see signs in the correct new Latin alphabet, and we see signs in a Latin alphabet that people are just using, just any letters that for example, there's no sh for sh in the new alphabet, but some people on their signs, they put sh for sh. So I think people are very confused because there's been so many versions, but there seems to be a bit of a new momentum picking up to try and get this done. I don't know when it will happen. But also to throw an extra kind of complication into the mix, the Organization of Turkic States adopted a resolution recently proposing a common Turkic alphabet for all the Turkic states that use the Latin alphabet. So let's see where that goes. Because the alphabet in Turkey is different, in Azerbaijan is different, in Uzbekistan is different, and in Kazakhstan is different. It looks different, and so on. So as you can see, it's rather a protracted, long process. It's rather an interesting sort of microcosm of the identity issues that Kazakhstan faces and the kind of grappling it has over language and culture because of this Soviet Russian imperial history. I think that's the most interesting part about it. And another point I should just mention about it is that, there have been sort of Russians up in arms in Russia, or including in Kazakhstan as well, about this. But, the point that it's really worth stressing is that it's not that Russian continues to enjoy a sort of secondary official status in Kazakhstan after Kazakh. Everybody has the right to communicate in Russian. If they go to a government office, the people must treat their query or their business in the language that they approach in, Russian or Kazakh. I mean, okay, it's not in every language that's spoken in Kazakhstan, but Russian has a very protected status in Kazakhstan, although you would never believe it to hear some of the griping that goes on. Often I think that's part of a sort of information campaign against Kazakhstan by some trolls in Russia. But the truth is that the alphabet change is slow, protracted, a measure of the geopolitics of it and of the historical baggage of it and the psychological baggage. And I should imagine it's going to happen at some point, but Russian will retain that protected status.
The other side of the diplomatic tightrope is China. I read a very good book a couple of years ago called Sinostan, and it was a sort of look at how Central Asia is going to be essential to China's geopolitical power over the 21st century. You mentioned in the book about Kazakhstan wanting to be the quote unquote buckle of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. But you also write very movingly in the book about Kazakhs who've been caught up in China's quote unquote re-education camps, and how sort of the Kazakh government has tried not to make a big deal about what's happening over the border, but also try and quietly encourage China to release its citizens.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's right. I mean, China is a huge player in Central Asia. In a place where formerly there was only one player, Russia. But when everything collapsed in 1991, there was just one player here, really. So China is now a huge player, and some of the countries much more are certainly very economically dependent on China, although most are also economically dependent on Russia. So they'll be dependent for varying sort of reasons. Turkmenistan, for example, China buys almost all of its gas, virtually 100% of its gas exports. And then there are other dependencies with Russia, for example, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan have sent so many migrants to Russia that they have those dependencies. And all of the countries have these synergies, different synergies involving energy or people or, economic links. But China has certainly become a really big player. And in Kazakhstan, and in some of the other countries, Kyrgyzstan specifically, I'm thinking of, it's not always popular. I think there are perceptions of China as being something other and something a little bit hostile, which sometimes in the past you didn't find about Russia, for example. And I think it's because it's something much more familiar. Russia and Russians are much more familiar to people here than China and Chinese. But also, of course, we've got this other element in the mix, which has been the treatment of the Muslim minorities of Xinjiang, most of them Turkic. So obviously Uyghurs in the re-education camps, which are effectively concentration camps, but also in addition to Uyghurs, Kazakhs. There are many Kazakhs in Xinjiang who've been caught up in that, and Kyrgyz too. So as you said, the government has walked a bit of a tightrope over this, and the issue has moved on, of course. The Chinese claim they've closed maybe all of those camps or those what they call vocational training centers, and now now that's finished. I mean, we don't know the truth of that, but we do know that many people have moved, either been released or been given long prison sentences rather than held in those internment camps. But going back to the question of the Kazakh government's reaction, as the Kazakh government has tried to walk a tightrope by trying to appease public opinion at home, but without actually criticizing China and while always engaging with China. And that's been quite difficult. I mean, at one time there were some protests about it in Kazakhstan, and protests are, still pretty rare in Kazakhstan because they're not usually allowed. And the government had said it was working behind the scenes and so on to try and, get some of the Kazakhs back here. And some of them were released, but also it notably at one point in around 2018-19, even into 2018-19, Kazakhstan was the real focal point of the world's reporting about Xinjiang because there was no access to Xinjiang in China. And there were so many activists and returnees and people who'd been released from camps or had relatives in camps here in Kazakhstan, and specifically in Almaty, where I am, that many of the world's media were flying in and doing the interviews. And there was also a big lobby group, a big, civil society organization that was doing enormous work to publicize that. But the government, made sure to eventually pressured so much that it kind of the whole thing was shut down. Even some of the activists who asked for asylum in Kazakhstan, they didn't have Kazakh passports. In other words, they're Kazakhs, but from China. They didn't get it. Some moved to third countries, and some, I guess, continue to live a precarious existence. And really, these days, it's not mentioned in the relationship. Tokayev and Xi seem to enjoy a pretty close relationship, and it doesn't seem to be a factor anymore in that relationship. And China continues to be a major, a huge economic and geopolitical player here. I mean, the only thing I would say on that is that when people talk about China supplanting Russia in Central Asia, it's really important not to disregard Russia's 300-year kind of history. It's basically entered northern Kazakhstan in 300 years ago. Or even longer. And you can't disregard the kind of political, economic, cultural, linguistic, and familial links, that link the Central Asian countries with Russia. And also, of course, you can't disregard the kind of threatening nature of Russia, the threatening dangers that the Central Asian presidents know about of if they were to turn away from Russia. We've seen what happens in Ukraine. So it's a complicated picture with the geopolitical kind of on the geopolitical chessboard. And the only other thing I would add there is the Central Asians, but the Kazakhs in particular, the Kazakh government is very keen not to be seen as some kind of pawn on the chessboard of Eurasia. And they're always keen to emphasize that they have agency, that it's not a great game, that, the Central Asians are players in their own right. And that's what they're trying to position themselves as now, I guess, during this war in Ukraine.
I mean, I guess connected to that, something I was thinking of was the sort of the Prigozhin mutiny and Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. They've exposed how much the Russian military is like tied up in Ukraine. And so I was curious, has that sort of emboldened the Tokayev regime as far as it comes to Russia? Or are there, as you said, those counterbalancing economic and familial relationships that still sort of factor in that kind of diplomacy?
I think in terms of the diplomacy, I don't know about emboldened. I mean, I think it's motivated Kazakhstan to be sure that the policy that it's always adopted, which they call multi-vector, as in we're friends with everyone, we cultivate relationships east and west and north with Russia, east with China and west with the West. And so Kazakhstan's always been pretty friendly towards the West, unlike obviously Russia. So I think it's motivated Kazakhstan to cultivate those relationships very, very actively. And I think it's found a very active response. I mean, you could even argue that it's the West that's become more actively interested in Kazakhstan than vice versa because of the war. But you can see a very big uptick.
I think Lord Cameron visited as Foreign Secretary.
That's right. And, his predecessor as Foreign Secretary also visited, and we've seen 5 summits between the 5 Central Asian presidents and a leader. For example, Biden's held a summit with the Central Asian presidents and German presidents here this week, the French and the European Union, the Commission holds a summit, the Chinese, the Russians. So there's a lot of diplomacy. In terms of the army being tied up and emboldened, I mean, I think Tokayev, whose history is as a diplomat, so he's a very seasoned diplomat, very seasoned foreign policy player. He's not looking at the short game. He's got his eye on the long game. Russia's military may be tied up now, but Kazakhstan still shares a 7,600 kilometer border with Russia. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. So I don't know if emboldened is the right word. I think Tokayev has tried to strike out a more independent stance from Russia than, say, Kazakhstan had in the past under Nazarbayev, who I think was very much a product of that Soviet regime that could only see Russia as a friend. Now, Tokayev was also a product of that Soviet regime, and that shows. But he's also a sinologist who spent time as a diplomat in Beijing in the 90s. So, he spent time in the West and occupied senior position at the United Nations. So he kind of sees more the value of the balanced approach. And it's notable that under Tokayev, Kazakhstan has absolutely held its ground on refusing to kind of endorse the war. I mean, it comes under criticism for not being more critical, but it's absolutely refused to endorse the war and always saying that its position is in support of UN principles, territorial integrity and sovereignty, which, in diplomatic speak, well, I mean, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? Given that it's Russia that invaded Ukraine. So I think it's very notable that Kazakhstan's held the line, even when put on the spot in front of Putin deliberately, in Russia. In St. Petersburg, on one famous occasion, he was on the stage alone with Putin and, the chief propagandist from Russia TV, who tried to put him on the spot and get him to offer support. And he simply held the line. And Kazakhstan has been accused of disloyalty because of that by many Russian commentators, not least because just before Russia invaded Ukraine, it sent troops to Kazakhstan to help to support the armed forces here in quelling unrest. So it's opened itself up to that charge, but Tokayev is very keen to hold that line. However, I mean, neither is Tokayev obviously going to enter into any open confrontation that could be provocative. And also, it's worth pointing out that you don't need an army to invade Kazakhstan to cause trouble in its northern cities with large Russian populations. You only need a few provocateurs. So, while the army is now tied up, I think we all know that the outcome of this war is extremely uncertain, extremely worrying for the whole world, for Europe and the world, and for countries that share long borders with Russia like Kazakhstan. And so the Kazakhs have all that in mind. I think they're not short-termists. They're looking at the long picture, and they always say that they're not pro-Russian, they're not pro-Western, they're not pro-Chinese, they're pro-Kazakh.
A theme of your book, I felt, is sort of struggles for survival at various levels of Kazakh society. So the country itself sort of maneuvering between, these two huge, powerful neighbors. But I also felt for many in the Nazarbayev regime, they had to sort of tread carefully to survive, and some, like his son-in-law, not surviving. I'm wondering if you could describe what the Nazarbayev regime was like for those within it, and also how did someone like Tokayev come out on top when other insiders didn't?
Well, then what the Nazarbayev regime was like, that's a really tough question. I mean, it was different things to different people, shall we say. I mean, for those who did well out of it, and the people obviously who did I think we should look at different layers. I mean, the people who did the best out of it were Nazarbayev's family and his cronies. And they made absolutely millions and lived like kings. And some of them, many of them still do. His family members, most of them, despite changes following unrest here in 2022, most of his family members continue to own, many assets and live nice lives. So, people made millions. There was a lot of corruption. The oil boom that occurred in the 2000s for most of that decade, brought a lot of money to Kazakhstan. A lot of it was stolen, squirreled away abroad. That had an impact for ordinary people and for the development of the country. His hubristic creation of a new capital in Astana, in the north of the country, also sucked up a lot of money and resources. And, there was a lot of resentment among lower layers of the population about that, about the corruption that fueled the regime, the nepotism, and about the fact that hardworking people simply couldn't get ahead. That it was, I think, during the oil boom in the 2000s, people kind of bought the social contract where they turned a blind eye to the absence of political freedoms in order for them to, to make their lives better. They started to be able to buy cars and go abroad on holiday to Turkey, Dubai. But, the first troubles really came in the financial crisis, the global one of 2007. And, things started to kind of go downhill. And then in, 2014, the annexation of Crimea, another fall in oil prices, people started to get poorer. And Nazarbayev's rule went on. And, he started to lose his kind of magic touch with the people. And not unconnected to that was that the economic situation was getting worse. And I think it's worth, if we're talking about disaffected people, and there were many of them. So while there were many contented middle classes, there were also a huge numbers of people in villages, for example, who didn't have running water, despite this oil-rich country and this bling-bling capital that was erected in the north of the country. And there are still many people in Kazakhstan who don't have running water, and it's an absolute travesty. I mean, it's an absolute, the government should be ashamed of itself. That it's 2024, that it's an oil-rich country, and that people live without running water is just, it's an embarrassment, and it's a tragedy for those people. But I think we can look at the disaffected people. It was summed up in the kind of the very first clear sign that things were going wrong with the Nazarbayev regime in 2011, when there was a big bout of unrest in the western oil fields in a town called Zhangozem. And really, it stemmed from, an oil strike that went wrong. But what it was really about was the kind of haves and the have-nots, and the perception that I'm working really hard, but where are the fruits of my labor? People living in these kind of dusty, kind of godforsaken towns without proper facilities, while they're watching on the TV that Astana is growing with these goldy buildings and so on. And so this kind of perceptions and this kind of gap between the propaganda and the reality started to hit home. And also, we should also mention, of course, as well as the kind of cronies, the rich, the super rich, which includes most of the Nazarbayev family, and as well as the disaffected underclasses, we should also mention the dissidents and the civil society activists who couldn't have their say at all in the journalists who would be imprisoned and sometimes suffer violence or journalists who had dead dogs pinned to their, editorial office walls, or funeral wreaths sent to them. And this atmosphere of intimidation was intense. So although ordinary people, if they kept their mouth shut and just complained to their friends, they wouldn't be afraid of that. Families, friends, or even just sitting in a restaurant, you could mouth off about the regime if you wanted to. Nobody would do anything. But as soon as you start in the media, and later in social media, and then and civil society activists, there was a lot of pressure on journalists, civil society activists, and so on, ordinary people who became too critical. And I have to say that continues to this day, despite Tokayev's rhetoric about him being different to Nazarbayev and being a listening state and granting people more freedoms. Many people are still going to jail for expressing their opinion, and people who try to go out and protest on the streets are often arrested and jailed. So, the legacy of this regime is intense and heavy, and also the willingness of Tokayev, despite his rhetoric, to actually make meaningful changes and grant people political freedoms and civil freedoms is so far not proven, and is very much in doubt.
Reading the book, I find it difficult to sort of gauge how autocratic the regime is, because on the one hand there's the corruption, there's the repression of opposition parties, the occasional disappearing of dissident voices, but then on the other, there's, as you've described, this sort of quite strong civil society streak there's some space for. And I get a feeling I got reading the book is that Kazakhs have a very strong sense of fairness, and it seems like the regime usually gets into difficulties when it offends that sense of fairness. It does something that goes slightly over the bounds, and that's usually where they get the reaction.
Yeah, that's a very good take, actually. I think that's very true. I mean, the times when we've seen either big protests or also violence in Kazakhstan has been when that sense of fairness has been offended. I mean, in what I was talking about, the oil strike that turned into deadly violence, and there people felt they were being treated unfairly while other people getting rich were not, kind of thing. I mean, at the very basic level. When Tokayev was appointed as Nazarbayev's successor, we saw what were at the time relatively big protests, because Kazakh's sense of fairness was insulted. It's only fair that now, after putting up with this regime for our whole lives, we should have the chance to choose our next leader. And so then we saw big but peaceful protests that didn't turn violent. And in 2022, we saw a very confused situation where which began as peaceful protests, and again about senses of fairness. I think it began over energy price rises, fuel price rises, but it's quickly spiraled into much more than that. The wider grievances over absences of political voice and socio-economic grievances. Again, we could talk about that as fairness. So I think that's all very true, and I think in Dark Shadows, you can see it's a portrait of a pretty authoritarian regime. The only reason I say pretty is because I lived, pretty as in quite, is because I lived in Uzbekistan in its worst years of dictatorship. So I do have something to compare to. And, the level of people in Kazakhstan, as you can see, did go out and do things. And there was, under Nazarbayev even, a sort of civil society that was so vibrant compared to the things it was up against. It's hard to believe it could be that vibrant, but it was, even though it was completely crushed and suppressed. I know it sounds paradoxical, but you can see for all the people who are out there in Dark Shadows under Nazarbayev, who are out there doing things and risking prison or worse, violence, or simply ruined careers and so on. You can see that there are brave people who were doing things. So it's really hard to say. I mean, it was the world's worst dictatorship, because you didn't necessarily go to prison even if you expressed your opinion. There were always red lines that the regime wouldn't let people cross, would punish people for crossing. And the truth of the matter is that Tokayev's government administration is the same. There are still so many red lines, so much fear of the people and their voice, it's kind of he likes to talk about being different, but we just see so many of the same things that it's a bit alarming to see that when you see the potential of Kazakhstan, and you see if they would allow, if the authorities would allow these vibrant people, young people, not only young people of all ages actually, but there's a great big, younger generation, millennials and Gen Zs, who have lots of ideas and are well educated and are open to the world and are well traveled, who could bring so much to the country if they were allowed to if more political and civil freedoms were allowed, so that, I think that's what the country needs to move ahead. And Tokayev has inherited this Nazarbayev regime. Now, you asked, how did he get out on top when the others didn't? I'm not even sure he did get out on top. I'm not even sure that he wanted that presidency, but it seems like he was Nazarbayev's choice as kind of a more, if you like, colourless figure who was presumed would obey orders, but that's not how it worked out, So how people survive? I mean, people survive in any of these regimes by towing the line, and Tokayev did toe the line under Nazarbayev, and now people are towing the line under Tokayev, and that's what's lacking. I mean, that thing where a vibrant opposition figure can come out and can emerge and be able to talk to people and say, this is, the old ways need changing. And there are many people in Kazakhstan who probably think that, but there's no outlet for their votes and their voices. And that's the challenge for Tokayev moving forward. He's a product of the regime himself. He says he wants to change it. He says he doesn't want to repeat the mistakes that led to terrible violence in 2022, in which 238 people died. That began as peaceful protests. It was certainly hijacked by nefarious forces trying to, do something very nefarious to him and to the country. But it's worth remembering that it was all about the people's, voice at the beginning. And so that's his challenge. He's a product of the regime. Can he deliver the kind of change that people are still really demanding? So Kazakhstan seems to be still in an unfinished process. So let's hope the path continues towards the correct destination.
Well, I mean, I was going to ask, how do you see the next few years or 5 years of Kazakhstan? How do you imagine things might play out?
Well, I mean, I think there are so many challenges for the country, political, economic, and geopolitical specifically. There are also opportunities. The political challenge is, we've probably discussed it. I mean, it's for Tokayev to loosen his grip on power and allow opposition. Now, genuine opposition just ends up in jail. We've seen a bit of a loosening of allowing a few new parties to form, but then they just go and sit in the rubber stamp parliament and nothing has changed. It's the government using the old tricks of allowing something to form and then co-opting it or just controlling it. It's not real opposition. And Tokayev has a real political challenge ahead of him, because he's promised to serve only this one 7-year term for which he was elected in 2022. So it seems far away, but in only a few years he needs to hand over power if he's going to keep his word, or he's simply going to become just another one of those Central Asian presidents who refuses to leave office and changes the constitution yet again. And also, the Kazakh people have shown time and again that they are prepared to go out on the streets and risk all kinds of violence when these kind of things happen. So it's a big risk. He doesn't show. He hasn't given any indication of how that succession might play out, and I think that's a big risk for Kazakhstan, but an opportunity as well. But I presume he should be thinking about the system, the political system, and the people who might be ready to take over. He should be thinking about that now. So, I don't know whether he is. And in terms of geopolitics, I think that's really, really challenging. A lot depends for Kazakhstan, as for the wider region and for Europe and the wider world, on how this war in Ukraine plays out, how it finishes, when it finishes, if it finishes. And for Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan is a prisoner of its geography. It's always going to have Russia as a neighbor. What Russia will that be? If it's a strong Russia that's been victorious in Ukraine, that sounds like a nightmare neighbor. But a weak, angry Russia is also rather worrying. We only have to think of, Germany in the 30s. So geopolitics are a huge challenge for Kazakhstan. But, they're also an opportunity, because, as I said, the West is now courting Kazakhstan as well. So Kazakhstan, if it can tread this diplomatic tightrope without falling off, has a lot of opportunities, including business ones, investment ones, and economic ones from this situation as well. And then, I think Kazakhstan has so many internal and external challenges. It's got to some degree a safe pair of hands with Tokayev at the helm, but to another degree, it needs some bold leadership that will inspire the people and carry them along. And it needs to make the kind of changes that the people have been demanding now for, certainly since Tokayev was first appointed as Nazarbayev's successor, that's 5 years, but they've really been demanding this for more than 10 years at least. And, I think the path ahead for Kazakhstan depends very much on, somebody being willing to make the kind of political changes that Kazakhstan needs. And I think a truly democratic government and parliament would help Kazakhstan navigate those geopolitical challenges much more robustly.
I guess my last question is, are you working on anything now?
Well, yeah, I'm just finalizing a chapter for a book that's being published in Kazakhstan. So this is the brainchild of a political analyst called Dosim Satpayev, and it's going to be a book about the challenges facing the world. So each author that he's approached, which include Kazakh writers and other foreign writers, including me, have picked a problem of our own choice, and we've written about that, a chapter for the book about that problem. And so my chapter is about the death of democracy ? So the dangers to democracy and it covers kind of Kazakhstan and Central Asia, but it's really about the wider world as well, the rise of populism in Europe, Donald Trump, and also, it covers countries like Turkey and India as well. So it's a broad view. It's a new departure for me because I normally only ever write about Central Asia exclusively. And the other thing that I've been working on is I have an article coming out in History Today magazine next month about the Jadids of Uzbekistan, the Jadid being a historical movement that are seen as kind of the fathers of independence of Uzbekistan. So look out for that one in History Today.
Joanna, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I have to say, I really enjoyed delving deep into Kazakhstan like that. If you want to buy Joanna's book and support independent stores in the UK, check out my bookshop.org page in the show notes. After now doing 4 episodes of Strategy Aaron, I'm really curious what you think about the show. Who would you enjoy hearing from? Are there things you'd like to see added? I usually quickly churn out my intros and outros, but would you like to hear more from me? Or even less? Please leave comments on whichever platform you're listening, as well as a cheeky little rating. Tune in next week.